For sure. Did Ameen make it onto this thing?
I'm here now.
Okay, right on. So you're the Moloch specialist, man. You've got the you have the strongest case here, dude.
My degree in Molochology.
Your degree in Molochology. That's right.
Yeah, sure.
Master of Moloch.
I'll give a little spiel. So I discovered Moloch because I got nerd sniped. I was living in a rationalist house in Berkeley in 2016, and they exposed me to a lot of rationalist scripture. One of which was Meditations on Moloch, a blog post by Scott Alexander, runs the blog Slate Star Codex. So I read that, and it kind of changed my life because, I'd grown up with this like anxiety of like, why can't people have nice things? Why can't we all get along? Why can't we all work together? Right. And then you see constant, just people just like screw everything up for everybody. And you're like, man, why does this happen all the time? And then I read Meditations on Moloch, and it put a name on that anxiety, and the name is Moloch, and it's framed as this god, ancient. It was the god of child sacrifice. Now it's framed as the rationalist god of coordination failure, and it's the god of why we can't all like have nice things, more or less, because every time we all try to work together, the incentive for somebody to defect increases. The more that everyone else wants to, have their happy utopia, and eventually that person defects and takes everyone else over, and they're the only player in the next round, and they make the rules, and the game sort of reflects their values. The degree to which Moloch has power is the degree to which we fail to work together. We want disarmament, at a global level. We want to have, spend our money from governments on infrastructure and healthcare and education and stuff like that, but we spend it on guns and bombs and planes, because if we didn't, then we know, if we all, everybody in the world got together and made a little kumbaya disarmament crew, then like whatever assholes stuck around and kept all their guns would take everyone else over and ruin everyone's day. And so we sit at this like inadequate, unfortunate equilibria between, where we want to be and where we are, and like that kind of sucks. But like the insight of Moloch is like, it kind of has to suck in that way unless we can upgrade how we all coordinate in order to make it suck less for everyone. And so it's not about getting, the people, that they're not all assholes. They're like assholes because the system forces them to be assholes, right? And so it's like what we need to do is figure out how to design better systems. And so learning about Moloch at the same time as right around 2016 or so, when I was discovered Ethereum, was a big deal for me, because then I was like, whoa, Ethereum is actually this technology to help people coordinate at a global scale, right? You can have these agreements, you can scale up trust, because I don't have to trust you, I trust the program. As long as we both know that the program's going to work, then we can scale up our trust. And so far we've seen it. I named the nonprofit Moloch Dao to help evangelize these ideas, but also to show that we could, coordinate funding using DAOs. And that was like one example of how to, scale our own coordination up to try and defeat Moloch using this advanced blockchain technology we can use to form these agreements, because everybody can sort of trust that the program will allow them to, exit the agreement in the case of Moloch DAO, as a way of scaling up coordination. So that's what Moloch meant to me, and that's why I wanted to bring the idea forward to the Ethereum community. And I'm beyond thrilled that the community has taken it up to try and find ways of defeating Moloch by all working together and making more social coordination tools.
Yeah. So I want to add one thing about the Moloch thing, which is a detail that I always found really compelling about that model, which is winners tend to overpay for their prizes. So if you get something like an auction, typically, you get many scenarios in which the person that wins the thing at auction winds up paying so much for it, they kind of almost wish they'd never bought it. So you create games in which even the winners feel like they're losing. And that is a very, very common part of existence under the conditions of direct head-to-head competition. If you set the auction up like winner takes all, first past the post, The rational point at which the second bidder drops out of the race and leaves you to win it is the point at which the second bidder doesn't think it's worth paying a penny more for, and you paid more than that. So those kind of mechanisms, it's not just that we're creating situations where we have defectors. Even in situations where it's just straight out competition, we've got models of competition which often leave the winners unable to actually prosper. So it's a really deep analysis. It's a very, very important blog post. Had a very substantial effect on me as well. It's our starting point.
You want to chime in on any of this, Kevin, since you haven't said anything yet?
Yeah. Hey, everyone. I'm Kevin Owocki with Gitcoin. So basically, to me, the really exciting thing about where we are in the Ethereum community is that we've got these coordination failures where people will rationally choose their own private gain over the public good and over common goods as a single player game. That's the rational choice. But when you make these games into multiplayer games, what you realize is that if everyone free rides on public goods and common goods and feeds Moloch, then eventually the system collapses under the weight of people's choices. And so what's really cool to me about where we are in the Ethereum space is now we have the stateful internet. Now we have a global web scale coordination mechanism for turning the single player game into a multiplayer game. And maybe the rational choice will shift from defecting and free riding into something that's a little bit more community oriented and collectivist that balances the needs of the collective, but with the needs of the individual without things like coercive taxation. So to me, that's where it really gets exciting. I have a philosophy minor from undergrad that I never applied ever, but now I'm seeing 15 years later the intersection of my computer science skills and startup skills with the sort of Molochian, how can we build better coordination systems, and the actual practical implementation of how do we build the sword that kills Moloch or that sets Moloch back is what's interesting to me.
Well said.
So, what Moloch have you guys been hunting recently?
Well, I will say there are many Molochs. There are many coordination failures in the world, but Gitcoin's mission is to grow and sustain open source software. Open source provides $500 billion per year in economic value, but it's actually built on the backs of programmers who are just, for the most part, working nights and weekends on open source away from their family and can't even pay their mortgage working on open source. And there's just a really big asymmetry between value created by open source and value captured by open source software developers, the people who are building our digital infrastructure. And so that's the one that we've traditionally been focused on in Gitcoin. And we only have, I'll say that there's probably many ways to use Ethereum to coordinate and to kill Moloch, but the one weapon that we use is quadratic funding, which sort of is a multiplayer game that allows us to coordinate to fund public goods in the Ethereum space. And it's just I think we're only scratching the surface of killing Moloch, but there's some promising progress for sure.
Yeah, how do we take it further into the real world, like from these digital solutions to like solving the actual problems from the like outside of crypto, from the examples in the Moloch reading?
Yeah, I think we're in this interesting inflection point in which the coordination mechanism that humanity has used for a lot of its problems in the industrial age has been nation state governments. And, there's coercive taxation, which goes into this giant administrative bureaucracy, at least in the United States, that says that it's administering the allocation of funding to our public parks and to clean air and to national transportation systems, open source software. But there's a question about how efficient it is and whether or not coercive taxation is something that is moral and good. And so I think we're in this sort of inflection point from the industrial age in which nation states organize this stuff to the information age in which we could have web scale approaches that are non-coercive to solve web scale problems. And so we're in this inflection point where I think that the old institutions are decaying, but the new institutions haven't exactly risen to replace them yet. And so I'll be curious what the other panelists think about that.
Yeah. How are you fighting the Moloch, Vinay?
So the angle that I've taken on this is looking at fraud. Right? So this is a two-sided question, right? So there are situations in which somebody simply lies to you about what something you want to buy is, and this creates one set of pathological incentives. There is another set of problems, which is where somebody knows something about an object and then chooses not to tell you when you're buying it. And these things are very tightly associated with each other. So what I'm working on right now is all of this very, very kind of slick and high concept physical NFT stuff, collectibles, gold bars, this, that, and the next thing. And this is to build the volume, build the scale, build the technology. But right on the back of this, we're going to do a radical upgrade to the way that things like fair trade work, where you can actually get very, very high quality documentation on the blockchain tied to legal liability structures right the way down the supply chain to your primary resource extraction. So the objective is you'll be able to get physical objects and basically see the entire graph of how the object was generated, where the energy came from, where the metal came from, who did the work, how were they paid, how do we verify that they were paid, all the rest of these structures, so that when you buy something, you understand the total moral graph from which that thing was generated. And that is very philosophically associated for me with Gandhi's Satyagraha, which is this notion of the power of truth, right? Like, Satya meaning truth, Graha meaning power. If you completely understand the truth about a situation, moral action emerges from that almost naturally for most people. And the place where morality dies is in the acceptance of the initial lie. If you don't let yourself be lied to, moral action results very naturally.
So to understand, it's like, I might be more willing to buy a thing if I knew that it was like, pure in its origins and construction all the way to my front door. And so I might price that higher, which sends a market signal to like get more of that.
So
right?
this is the passenger in the car, right? The driver in the car is, a lot of markets have 20 to 30% of fake goods in them, like wine, 20 to 30% fake. So what pays for the creation of the rail is you want to buy wine and you do not want to be defrauded in the process. You're willing to pay a premium for wine that has very high quality data attached. And then what comes along for the ride with that high quality data is, oh, and by the way, here are all the certificates indicating how it was grown, who grew it, that it came from a country with good labor practices. Because there isn't enough demand for moral and ethical goods to finance the creation of a technological infrastructure to support that alone. It has to be carried by the anti-counterfeiting work.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's carrot and stick.
Interesting. Yeah, it's pretty cool. It kind of reminds me of like there was like power surges, and then people like, they paid thousands of dollars to keep their fridges on, and it's like for lack of a price signal that they could be like, the power is really expensive, turn my fridge off. If the power gets above, and that's just like how energy markets work, they like don't give you the signal back, so you can't make your own informed decision on that. So
absolutely.
Yeah. I agree with Owocki too that we're in this like weird phase where like I think finally people realize that this stuff isn't going anywhere. Like that's all we've gotten to so far, is that like our crazy experiments are like, oh, they may have some merit. Like quadratic funding, like, all right, that's kind of cool. Like, what can we do with that? DAOs, all right, that's interesting. But we haven't gotten to the this is obviously how you do everything point.
Right.
Like, assuming that we're not totally insane, the journey is from here to that point. Right?
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess we have these tools of programmable money, and what will we use them for? And I think we're in this sort of punctuated equilibrium where like we have the tools now, and there's a bunch of unsolved problems, and it's just kind of like a Monte Carlo where all the different participants are trying to figure out what they want to use the tools for. So yeah, it's transition. I think between the old world and the new, and it's just kind of awkward because none of these tools are ready yet. Like Gitcoin can, I don't know what other systems are doing, and apologies for over indexing on my own project, but Gitcoin can only do $1 million per quarter because we haven't solved Sybil resistant identity yet, which is a core part of quadratic funding. Whereas there's $500 billion in value created by open source software, we can only do $1 million per quarter, which seems big until you realize that there's 500 billion that needs to be funded of open source software.
And this goes back to the fraud problem that Vinay is talking about, right? It's sort of rampant.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, identity is hard. Do you know the term smurfing? So it's the way that people do money laundering in some countries. You're going to send $1 million to somebody. You break it up into 1,000 payments of $1,000 and get 1,000 different people with real legal identities to go pick up the money, and then you reassemble the payment on the other side.
Yeah.
And in a world that has smurfing as an option, it's very hard to figure out how to de-smurf these things.
Yeah, for sure. We're actually, I mean, like, to some extent, we've built tripwires into Gitcoin grants and quadratic funding, but to another extent, the attackers keep evolving. It's like a chicken and the egg game. I guess cat and mouse is a better analogy. And we actually recently hired block science to just kind of go through the data every round and sort through it and basically figure out all the attack vectors and build mathematically based tripwires into the QF data set, which we can then surface to some sort of governance process to figure out whether or not people are attacking the system. And, the case of manufactured identities is definitely one of those things. It's cool to learn about smurfing.
Manufactured identities, but also manufactured agency. A real person acting as an agent of another person that's the smurfing problem right there. The smurf actually exists. He's just not acting with his own agency. The original hired shill.
Yeah. There's this concept that we've come up with block science. Well, we haven't come up with it. They're all like math PhDs, and they came up with it. And it's called the optimality gap, which is basically like, if you look at it from an agent-centric problem, what is the most a grant could get? Like if they broke all the rules. So you take that point, and then you take, that's called the optimality point. And then you take what they actually raised, and then the optimality gap is like the difference between those 2 points. And then you can use that to see how close to, like, mathematically in an n-dimensional space, how close to is each grant to colluding with another. And so the case of manufactured identity is one, but manufactured agency, I think, is also a really interesting one as well.
I think it's great that we're running all these experiments, because I think like plowing hard into continuing to run these experiments is how we get to, the final state of, this is all obvious. And it's like, it'll all be obvious once we've like already made all the mistakes and hit all the dead ends, and like figured out, because like other people aren't going to, find this enlightening if we haven't figured out how to make it work for ourselves. Right. So we have to, that's a thing that is like underestimated. I think we brought this up on our Bankless stuff, but like leadership itself is like kind of underrated in this case, because like you actually have to, it's not enough to like build, for example, like a DAO platform. You have to like actually go and build that, like show people how to do it, and like, run the quadratic funding experiments, get all the data, explain how it works, like figure out the attack vectors, and like create something robust to then be able to export. Right. And so like the way we do things in Ethereum is actually the thing that we're exporting.
I think that one thing that's sort of interesting, a trend that I saw, was that in 2017, everything you launched had to be perfectly decentralized from the start. And it's funny that all these teams took like 18 months in order to launch something back then. But I think that what we've seen in the bear market is that teams moved much towards perfect not being the enemy of good. And just building very simple experiments that you could then iterate upon was sort of a change in how I saw the Ethereum community working on these things. And I just want to like say here, like, my hand to God, Gitcoin is centralized as fuck right now, and I'm sorry, but we're doing it so that we can focus on the product and community and not like fight with regulators about whatever. And I want to say that also Moloch Dao, Ameen, I've got to give you props, because there was a time in 2017 in which everyone was building these really super complicated DAO frameworks And then Ameen and a few of the developers in his network came up with this idea of Moloch Dao, which is kind of like a minimum viable DAO. And it was actually used, as opposed to all these projects that raised tens of millions of dollars that never really launched because their products were too complicated. And so iterating and failing fast, I think, is one of the ways that we like explore this new space with all these new tools and find things that are actually working. Failing fast and iterating towards success is how I see it happening.
I think I also want to give credit to Peter Pan, who was like the, if I was the crazy person who started the movement, I don't know if you guys have seen that like 4-minute how to start a movement thing. Like he was the second guy that jumped on there and started dancing with and like Meta Cartel, like Peter was the first power user of the Moloch Dao framework. And what he created with Meta Cartel was like beautiful, and everyone who was in Meta Cartel has like gone off and crushed it. And I'm like super proud of everyone who brought their DAO knowledge to the rest of the community. So
the Meta Cartel. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, I just want to say so many great things spawned out of that.
I'm really glad that Moloch members voted not to let Peter in. The first time around that he went around and started his own. I was like, best timeline ever.
I think it's sort of interesting. So like one of the things that I've been like, basically, if you think about programming these systems, what do you program them for? Do you program them for individual gain or for public gain, right? And so there's this concept of bentoism, which is how do you go from just programming individual incentives for the profit motive into a system to like programming it for everyone's gain. But that's a huge gap. Individual one person and like the whole world is what, 7 billion people or something like that. And what to me is interesting about Meta Cartel is that not only are they Ethereum natives, but they're like right here in that spectrum, like 200 people who give a fuck about each other. And so, it's kind of like an incremental thing on like from what is my personal profit motive and what's good for me to the whole world and what's good for the whole world, to have this stopping off point of, oh, we've got 200 to 500 people. I don't know how many people are in Meta Cartel that we can program a system that's in everyone's gain. So it's a spectrum, and Meta Cartel is a really interesting and important experiment on that spectrum.
Carrying on your point about the awkward phase that we're in between, being governments and like being our own infrastructure providers and stuff. And it's like, I don't know about you guys, but the more I think about like nation states and whatever, the more I like can't separate the concept from like an assassinations guild with a public goods department.
I do actually have a decent answer to assassination politics. This has been a puzzle in my mind since I first heard about AP back in now we're talking back in the day. My approach to AP is that the first thing you have to do is list the founders of any AP network on their own AP network and all the other AP networks that may exist. And I think that's the only way of deterring AP.
So, sorry, what's AP?
That's a long story.
Okay.
He's trying
you need to know.
Oh, assassination politics. Okay, that's what it says.
Are you trying to undo the Roko's basilisk of the future guild?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think listing people on their own networks, on their own AP networks, seems like a very, very reasonable way of handling the AP problem, right? Somebody sets up an AP server, and the first thing that goes up is a $5 million contract for the heads of the people who set up the AP server. That to me looks like a fairly substantial deterrent, I like it because it's recursive, so we know that right?
Yeah, 100%. I guess like the weird conclusion of this stuff is like the more that we see states fail, the more I wonder like to what degree can we assume some of the responsibilities of the state, right? And like that has different factors. It's like, I can get COVID tests for people, at some point. Like, they weren't available on the public markets. It took a long time, but like, by back channeling and private, deals, you can acquire some. But it's like, where is the government in helping me out and like getting tests ready so that I could test everyone so that we don't have to be depressed for months? It's like okay, and then eventually it's like, to what degree do you need the government to protect your own sovereignty, right? It's like the end game. And it's like, sovereignty of who? It's like, is this me versus my neighbors, or is this like my community versus neighboring community, or is this like all of our communities against foreign invasion?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like and to some degree, like, I don't know, I'll bring this up here because I know Peth likes acid. So I did some acid, and I was like, how do you scale up America? And like the interesting Moloch frame for America is like, America has states, and states are supposed to have rights and some amount of sovereignty within themselves, but then they contribute to this like federal system, which sort of necessarily has to engage in the economies of scale of violence. But what if we could use this state carve out and annex the entire world and turn like Argentina into a state, and turn Brazil into a state, and be like, America's going remote first.
Yeah. I mean, I can say here, right? If the American government, when they invaded Iraq, had either made Iraq into a state or simply given Iraq a copy of the U.S. Constitution and left, I think you would have had some very substantially different outcomes from that. It was extremely peculiar to me that after invading Iraq, Iraq was not given a constitution based on the U.S. Constitution. That would have been like, here we invaded to bring you some American values, and here's some American values. Like you could have respected that as a stance. Like, it's kind of a self-replicating empire, but at least they give you the stuff that they've got at home. This is not what happened. The empire is kind of do what we tell you, not do what we do. So here we've got another angle on this, which is the problem of commons and commons management, right? I think Eleanor Ostrom has done some staggeringly good work on figuring out how people in these kind of guild structures can self-regulate and protect their guilds. She won a Nobel Prize for that. And I think that her work is sort of the antidote to the, Ayn Rand or bust style libertarianism that you see in a lot of crypto corners. I think Ostrom is very much she's the Hayek of communities. And I think Ostrom's work is, we haven't really seen an attempt to build software directly to implement Ostrom's rules. But I think that is potentially a frontier that I would like to take a serious crack at. It's going to come up in my own work when we start doing the tokenization of these Stradivarius violins and so on this year. So I think we're going to try and build Ostrom-style governance mechanisms around things like violins.
Cool.
It's an experiment, but I have a good feeling about it. I think the Ostrom approach has a lot to recommend it.
I think that one thing for me that sort of, I think about when we think about the question of how do you scale America is, well, I've been watching a lot of History Channel and like how territories are formed and how countries and nation states invaded other countries. And it strikes me that like the question, how do you scale America, is a very skeuomorphic question. So basically, like if you were just to scale up nation states, then what you get, I think, is the United Nations, like a body where diplomats can come together and sort of like resolve things between nations and maybe create some sort of global governance that includes everyone in the world. That's like the skeuomorphic nation state growth of governance. But what I think is interesting about the internet is that it allows us to create from first principles a organization that people can opt into that actually has teeth anywhere in the world because of the execution of immutable smart contracts. And we sort of like go over the threshold in which skeuomorphism, like the American nation state model, is no longer the paradigm that you're in. You're in a whole new world. Like, you flipped the bits and now you're in the alternate reality. And it's just like a completely different paradigm to be building this in. And I like the idea of taking Ostrom's principles and building it into that world. Sorry, go ahead, Vinay.
No, I was just agreeing. I think that this notion that we try and get away from Westphalian models of governance as we head into an environment where wealth no longer is created from land. A huge part of the I think this is worth talking about. So, the Westphalian model basically assumes that when you capture land, you capture value, and that the job of the nation state is to capture land, tax on the people that live on the land, and this generates value. But now, in the UK, agriculture is 1% of the economy, and in the UK, I want to say agriculture is maybe 5 or 7% of the economy. Relatively insignificant. I mean, like video games probably generate more wealth in the UK than agriculture does. So that might even be literally true. So in that sort of environment, the entities which manage value capture and governance inside of non-land systems are typically corporations. If you've got some kind of network that's producing video games, that network is only very incidentally part of the nation-state paradigm because it happens to be where the people, have their houses. But all the value creation is essentially happening from a Git repository. So this approach of governance relative to the value stream turns into government. This leads to questions like how long before corporations can join the United Nations? Or what does it look like for the corporations that have a body which is equivalent to the United Nations but represents their interests? And, if you ask me about the future of global government, I would have to say I think we're going to wind up with a three-group system. The UN for nation states, something that probably emerges out of WEF for corporations, and then something which is a direct democracy of the citizenship, largely probably organized around David Chaum's random sample voting models, because that makes it extremely affordable to do this kind of global governance stuff. Chaum's random sample voting is outrageously good. It's really, really important. I recommend everybody go read about random sample voting, because I think it is, without any shadow of a doubt in my mind, the future of democracy.
Have you guys read Damon and Freedom by Daniel Suarez?
I've not yet read that.
I started Damon. I couldn't get through it. Something about the writing style. What excited you about it? I mean,
well, it's like this game designer dies, and then as he dies, he like unleashes this program on the world, and it first takes over and then like organizes the planet, and it's a daemon because it runs itself. It doesn't have people running it, but it like hires people, and it essentially creates this like AR video game where you like run around doing quests for the daemon and like getting points and leveling up. And then like leveling up means that you can access more parts of the daemon's network. So by the end of it, there's this guy who's like max level, and he's got a legion of samurai sword wielding motorcycles that he's all controlling, autonomously, just like slicing people up. It's pretty cool. But then like he becomes this sort of like terrorist figure. And then the whole network has to like work together to bring him down. And they create this like direct democracy system, where people vote, and then create this like other avatar that, hurts, can like decrease his power level so that he can't control as many motorcycles.
So that his ninja army is somewhat depleted. They basically have to nerf him by shipping a patch.
Basically. So they all gang up to nerf him. Things like this are super interesting. I mean, we see this like corporate takeover of politics, right? Like when Parler got shut down by all the corpos, and the Trump fanatics got shut down. Like that was a corporate power play. Like Trump getting kicked off Twitter, right? Mm-hmm. That's like that's a move in that direction, and it mirrors like some of these like merchant takeovers historically. Like I guess where is the Magna Carta for central banking? Like at what point do the merchants rise up and are like, this is bullshit?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, US politics has become increasingly dominated by corporations. I think that sort of had the hope that they were going to be able to stabilize the ship. And instead, what we've discovered is that the more corporate money you put into politics, this sounds terrible. So if the only lever that corporations have for steering the political ship is bribing politicians, all that you get at the end of the process is a country run by incredibly corrupt politicians. If we had figured out a clean way of putting corporate money into politics, or at least representing corporate interests in politics, possibly you would have a situation in which, because you could visibly see what the corporations were up to, you would wind up with less corrupt politicians because you had direct representation and therefore transparency and monitoring around corporate involvement. I don't know. I mean, yeah, when I used to hang out with kind of leftists and anarchists more, there was always this thing of like, the corporations, they run everything. And I'm like, look, think of the government as being a 6'2" skinhead with no front teeth, holding half a dozen pit bulls on chains, right? The skinhead is the government and the pit bulls are the corporations. Which one of these things is actually your problem, right? Because the corporations are extremely influenced by and represented all of the interests of the US federal government. Much as we've seen the corporations drop the ban hammer on Trump, Trump was not really representing the interests of the American government. Trump was doing his own thing from the office of president. Much as there was a lot of discussion about the deep state, I have a feeling that it was just a whole bunch of very, very, very upset bureaucrats. Like, you don't understand, my department is in ruins. Bob, if you do something about this, I guarantee that we will not come down to you for antitrust next year. Okay, can we cut a deal? I don't think the deep state in Trump's instance was like, the CIA hate Trump. I don't even know if the CIA had an opinion on Trump. But just the sheer inconvenience of having to try and run a government with Trump in charge of it, I have a feeling that's sort of what turned into the deal that was cut with Silicon Valley to get rid of the man. And I think it was a deal with Silicon Valley to get rid of him. I think it was a pretty explicit negotiation. Yeah, no doubt.
So I guess if we've got the three pillars you were talking about, the UN for nation states, some sort of like merchant HQ for corporations, how do the people get this voice, right? Because it's ultimately a coordination problem, right? And I guess what I would say is that grassroots network that start with individuals, like things like Bitcoin, things like Ethereum, are like a way for people to express a value. Where for Bitcoin, it's the expression of, hey, central bankers, this is kind of crazy. I demand an alternative to an alternative store of value. And I can express that in this network. And then we can actually align between individuals and corporations at that level. I guess it's possible that in the future, we align all three, right? If the governments also have, Bitcoins on their balance sheet, then, we've won, right? But that isn't a governance thing, right? It's like, the only way that succeeded is by eliminating any ability for anybody to govern it.
Yeah. I used to talk about this in the context of de-governancing, right? As soon as you share something, you wind up with governance wrapped around the thing that you're attempting to work with. If you and a bunch of people decide we're going to buy a bus and we're going to share the bus, you're going to have constant governance grinding on the bus. But if instead of buying the bus, we take that money and we all buy a bicycle, an electric bicycle, then at that point, we no longer have arguments about where the bus is going to be, right? And there are some trade-offs there. Maybe the bus is more useful in some instances, but a bicycle that you can actually use is probably more useful than a bus that's always in the wrong place doing somebody else's business. So, solar power, Starlink, effective water filtration, cheap effective water filtration, mesh networks, ultralight construction technology. There are a whole bunch of factors which are coming together to make it possible for people to live relatively autonomously, more or less anywhere they want to live in the world. And I think post-COVID, what we're going to see is an enormous fanning out, particularly into areas that currently have crappy internet and then suddenly get decent internet because of Starlink. And you'll just see this radical transformation of we've just broken the concept that the cities are the only places where things happen, and everything just fans out to the edge and fans out to the edge and fans out to the edge and fans out to the edge. I'm certainly heading in that direction pretty soon if I can manage it.
Yeah, that's an interesting point in favor of non-skeuomorphic future societies, where like it's not so much that like it's cities ganging up. It's like smaller, tribe, more, I don't know, community oriented, societies that then decide to work together somehow.
Yeah.
I think last time we talked, Kevin, we talked about like peer-to-peer like defense pacts. Like, imagine yourself as a sovereign. And I'm like, Vinay, like you are my blood brother. If someone attacks you, like I will come to your defense. But
yeah. Having grown up in Scotland in the 1980s, I got to say that I've seen a fair amount of that stuff for reals.
Right.
I mean, it kind of like, when the government no longer has a monopoly on violence, what is the mechanism for protection that you have? It's, I don't know, it's kind of scary because like what I don't want to do is degrade into like mob rule or into, like basically sort of like, I forget the name of them, like basically like criminal organizations that have drugs and gangs and stuff like that. But, having a peer-to-peer defense pact, if it's a militia, sounds a little bit more good.
Well, so, I mean, the peer-to-peer defense pact that we could really use is litigation funding pacts, right? I mean, the risk that most of us have is not that we are going to get into, some kind of dreadful confrontation with some, rogue biker gang that will hunt down our people to the ends of the earth. It's that we wind up in some awful, long, drawn-out litigation with some total maniac that will not stop sending lawsuits. And this drains our coffers, and then we go bankrupt and our life is destroyed. So, you can imagine a bunch of people in crypto putting up bonds in a DAO. And I think this is actually a safe instance for a DAO, pretty much. Safer than most of them anyway. Everybody puts in 25 or 50 grand into this thing, and it just sits there. And if somebody gets hit with, pestilential and egregious litigation, then the DAO basically steps in and, protects their assets. And those kind of mutual insurance pacts, they're relatively light legally. You don't put the money into them with the expectation that you're going to gain. They could easily handle payments in crypto. And those kind of structures are what mutual support, mutual defense would look like in the game that we're currently playing.
Very cool idea.
And then the question is, if somebody stood that up, how much money would go into that? Who would be able to contribute? And, you're not going to let somebody into the pool of people that have a pool, that have the right to draw down that pool, unless you're relatively confident that that person is not going to need it, right?
Right. Yeah.
So you can begin to use. Oh, sorry, go on.
I was just saying, you're not going to let somebody in who's doing all sorts of crazy stuff that's going to put everybody at risk because they're going to need the money, and you have your own sort of insurance rating on.
You see, and you can tell, right? Like, so what pools is that guy in? Well, he's in the super high risk $300 maximum going in, Pyrovest pool that went bankrupt a couple of times in the last 2 years from litigations. But he's also in, this other pool, which is a lot more reputable. You can imagine that as being like reputation management for reals, because it's not reputation management like, vote on the last interaction you had with this person. This is kind of bullshit. That's just surveillance, right? But reputation management in terms of I carry legal exposure for this person's behavior, and how much exposure I'm carrying is fixed at a dollar value that you and I can both see on the network. That kind of model comes very closely from David Friedman's work, and I think that is the right way to do reputation on chain, right? If you put up 25 grand that says, right, this is the pool that the following 17 people can pool on in the event that they've got legal trouble or some other kind of trouble, right? That's the pool that my friends have access to. Any one of these people can draw down up to 25K, but after that's done, there's no more money in that bucket. Immediately, I know something extremely tangible about your relationship with those people.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
They're clearly your intimate, trusted friends that you trust not to need that or to stand on their own feet to the point where they're only going to use it in emergency. And I think that those kind of models have an enormous amount of power to really make trust explicit. Not in the sense of like, I think I trust that person, but like, here is my wallet, and I have left a chunk of my wallet with these people. Now I trust them. Mm-hmm. Evidential trust systems like that, I think those are hugely powerful. I wish somebody would build one. Hint, hint.
Hold my beer.
It kind of struck me as like, I feel like we started off this movement and like there's this idea of the Dao, which is like this big like idea, and the implementation of it was fairly brittle. Like the state machine was kind of complicated, and I wonder if the world that we're moving towards is a little bit more like an emergent one, like what happened with Wall Street bets, where basically just like a bunch of individuals independently decide that something's fucked up and that they want to change it, and so their collective action is channeled through the internet and eventually through the internet of money towards creating an emergent structure that's very fluid in how it develops. And it's the scale and the speed of the thing that is so challenging to the old world. And you won't see it coming, but once it happens, the fact that the world has changed will be obvious. And so I guess all I'm saying is that like in the future, I'm hoping that we start to see these non-skeuomorphic type of organizations that are rapidly evolving around. Like in the old world, we used to govern ourselves around geography because that's what our meat sack bodies made us do. But now we can organize around interests and value sets and create DAOs and packs around interests. And I think that that's a really interesting sort of new world thing to think about, especially when you combine it with how the scale and speed with which these things can develop once someone carves a path for them.
Yeah. Before we wrap this thing up, because I'm aware we're headed for the end of our time, I want to throw out a concrete proposal for doing something about funding of open source. So here is my concrete proposal. About 10 years ago, maybe a little longer, I came within a few inches of getting Flutter built directly into Ubuntu. Do you guys remember Flutter?
The tipping system, right? FLATTR.
Yeah, that's the one, right? So the way that it worked is that you flutter a number of things every month. Some of them are just incidental and some of them are recurring. And at the end of the month, the system says, right, how much money would you like to drop on the things that you flattered this month? You say $200, and it then automatically allocates them depending on how much attention you gave that thing. So at the time, I was talking to the Flutter guys, I was talking to Shuttleworth Foundation, got some meetings set up, and the idea was that you would build Flutter directly into Ubuntu. So at the end of the month, it would say, here are the following programs that you used by the number of times you used them and the number of hours you spent looking at them, if it was a GUI tool. Would you like to contribute something to the maintenance of these operations through your Flutter? You say, sure, you drop the change on them, it goes out and it's fanned out. Now, obviously, moving small amounts of money, big problem. Flutter was doing okay on that, but not fantastically. Privacy issues, obviously very kind of weird issues inside of that. In these kind of systems, how do you make sure that you don't wind up with huge amounts of personal information about what software people are running, kicking around the network? So Flutter did not, because it was a fiat kind of system, Flutter didn't really have the technology base necessary to to bring all those pieces together into the form that was necessary. But now, if this was done with crypto, right, what would it take to put a crypto funding rail for open source software developers directly into the Linux ecosystem, right? Here's a daemon that sits there and figures out what programs you've got on your screen. It also figures out, probably integrates into the window manager, figures out what you're using if you've got terminals open. And at the end of that process, makes donations, right? Where do the donations go? How are the donations managed? That's where the governance comes in. So you say, okay, this is a new utility. We're going to give this money straight to FSF. Is that the right way to do it? Or do we need to figure out whether to give this to the authors or not? Now we have a governance question. Who is going to be the person that decides where the money goes relative to a specific program? And for the programs that don't have a charitable foundation associated with them, how do we then flow the money right through to, for example, individual programmers? So I think there's a huge amount of potential for actually unifying the open source world and the crypto world in lines that are very, very close to what Gitcoin is doing right now. The trick of it is that you need a bunch of, how do I say this exactly? You need a bunch of infrastructure directly built into the software, into the operating systems or beside the operating systems to directly gather the use information.
Yeah, it sort of reminds me of this tool that Open Collective built called Back Your Stack, where you could basically just ingest a open source repository and it would tell you like every dependency you have for that, and you could one click contribute to all of them. So this is like that, but for the Linux ecosystem, and I think that tools that take the work out of supporting public goods are super important, or much less like take the work and make it feel like a collective game. I think are super important. And there's maybe an opportunity that you identified with Flutter, which it sounds like was built on the industrial payment rails to migrate over to crypto.
Yeah, it's pre-crypto, right? It's pre-crypto.
Yeah.
But the trick of this is getting the data in at the operating system level. Somebody's got to actually sit down and build that. And that, again, it's another one of these things that something in crypto land ought to have enough bank balance to go out there and build that kind of tooling. But I just don't know who's got that kind of vision, because crypto is very, very inward facing right now. One of the things I'm hoping. Oh, go on.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Go ahead, Vinay.
No, please.
Oh, I was just going to say, this might be a good time to tell everyone that Gitcoin Grants is building a quadratic funding tool with Open Collective for funding traditional open source software. Nice. So we're peeling away the word Gitcoin and anything related to crypto, and we're calling it fundoss.org. And it's just going to use Stripe in order to do quadratic funding in the mainstream. So, with respect to crypto being inward focused, then that brings quadratic funding a little bit more mainstream, but it's a different model than Flutter, which sounds like a valid model as well.
Yeah, I mean, Flutter is, here and gone. I'm not even sure it's still running. Because it needed better rails than the credit card system to really thrive. So I think that the stuff that you're talking about is an excellent move in the right direction.
Yeah, appreciate that. And hopefully we had a developer who was working on the project who got crypto rich and then disappeared. And so the project's been set back a little bit, but hopefully in the next month and a half, we'll launch it and we'll have some results to show.
Excellent. Cool.
Well, thank you so much, gentlemen, for that amazing talk and for your insight. It's a pleasure to have you all in one place and riffing on how to make the world better and how to overcome the problems that are injecting themselves between coordination. So hopefully that gave everyone enough to chew on for how to break down some barriers and how to move forward. I'm definitely looking forward to the consensus voting. And Gitcoin and the Giveth are both amazing ways that you can contribute to communities directly. So thank you so much. I'm going to invite our next speaker, Martin, to introduce themselves and talk a little bit about their talk about moving towards a steady state economy.
Cool. Bye. Thanks for having me.
This was fun. Peace out.
Thank you.